Hey guys, I just did a video titled Perfect on the case of Christopher Watts, and it got me to thinking again about the case of Darlie Routier. And just my opinion, but the similarities between these two moms just seem very glaring. Darlie Routier is sitting on death row, convicted of capital murder. Her sons were murdered on June 6 of 1996 in Rowlett, Texas. And Darlie dialed 911 at 2:31 a.m. and reported that an intruder had stabbed her children. In the video that I just did about the case of Christopher Watts, I was saying how I think that Christopher Watts' wife was lying about a lot of things, including her health, or I should say her health challenges, as she called them. She claimed she had all sorts of different diseases, and one of Christopher Watts' friends said that it seemed like all she had to do was watch a commercial about another medication and she'd hear of a new disease and she would claim to have that disease too. She claimed that she saved her husband's life by detecting his cancer early, except he never had cancer. And she had a long list of illnesses that she wanted to label her children with, one of them being familial Mediterranean fever. I talked about how she seems to be lying in all of her videos and her Facebook posts and her text messages. I think she was lying about their finances, even to her own husband. And I think in her case, the truth was about to become known, because I think her husband was leaving her. So it got me to thinking about the Darlie Routier case, because in Darlie's case, I don't know, the two women just seem so much alike. They both just kept spending and spending and spending regardless of their husband's ability to pay. They both wanted to go on those vacations. And they both seemed to be very self-centered and hyper-focused even on appearances. They were both behind in the house payments, struggling to make ends meet. And in Darlie's case, and in the case of Christopher Watts, I think both women were realizing that their husbands were leaving them. I don't think it was simply a divorce, though, that would have upset them so much. I think what was most upsetting to both of the women was the thought of actually having to get a real job. I don't believe the claims that people are making about Christopher Watts' wife and her employment. I don't believe them at all. I'm even beginning to question if she ever even worked for the hospital, because it sure doesn't make sense to me that she had a job where she could work 90% of the time from home answering the phones for the hospital. While Darlie worked, when she was young, her husband got her a job with him where he worked. But she only lasted a couple of weeks before she came into work one day saying that she had just fallen in the parking lot and that she was in so much pain that she just couldn't work anymore. And then shortly after that, she had their first baby. Well, she got pregnant for their first baby. And I don't think she ever worked outside the home again. She claimed to be in charge of the finances, and she claimed to be handling all the bookkeeping, too, for her husband's company. Kind of like how Christopher Watt's wife claimed to be handling the finances, because you know what? The bills were not getting paid. They were both still going shopping, though, and they were both still planning their vacations. And they both had moments when they seemed agitated by the mere presence of their children. Interesting, isn't it? What if Darlie Routier would have died that night that two of her children were murdered? She said one time in an interview from behind bars that if she had died that night, then she has no doubt her husband would be sitting right where she was, on death row. The similarities are there, you guys. You can't make this stuff up. I think both women needed help before the murders, of course. In Darlie's case, she told her best friend that she didn't want to go for help because she didn't think it would look good in a custody battle. I think Christopher Watt's wife needed help too. And in fact, I think she actually did have a situation where people knew that she had a problem. But evidently, help wasn't available for her either. I think both women realized not so much that their husbands were leaving. I think both women realized it was time for them to go get a real job. And I don't think either woman thought that they should have to actually work. I think both women expected their husbands to keep right on, giving them whatever they wanted. Do I think Darlie Routier is guilty? Oh, you bet I do. I think it's really unfortunate that she has not talked about what happened that night, because had she, at some point in the last, I don't know, almost 23 years, had she come clean, had she actually told the truth about what she did, then I think people would be wanting to find out what happened. Why would she have suddenly done something so horrific? And maybe they would have been concerned and wanting to learn about the fen-phen she was taking, or whether or not she had some sort of postpartum depression going on. But isn't it interesting, again, her comment that she made, that had she died that evening, and remember, she stabbed herself in the arm and she sliced a gash on her throat, and the physical evidence pretty much proves it, that she stood at the sink while she injured herself. Had she died that night, I think she's right. I think her husband would have been convicted. So why is it such a stretch to think that maybe in the case of Christopher Watts, that it was actually his wife who murdered their children? And could it be that she actually harmed herself too? Could it be that Christopher Watts is really blaming himself for what happened, whether or not he was the one who actually caused anybody's death? In Darlie's case, she hopped right on the phone and dialed 911 with her story that there was an intruder. But in Christopher Watts' case, he didn't dial 911. It's all very strange, and the similarities, again, are just spooky. It really makes you stop and think. At what point in Darlie Routier's life did she maybe begin to think that she shouldn't have to actually work to help support her family? At what point in her life did she think that she should be able to spend money no matter how maxed out her charge cards were? She had to have the big brand new house. She had to have the vacations. She had to have the store-boughts and the fake nails. And she evidently had to have the husband to pay her way instead of ever being responsible for herself or for her children. Did she think that her husband was divorcing her and that she would actually have to work for a change? And did she decide then that she was going to hurt him in the way that she knew would hurt him the most? I think the husbands in these cases are also pretty similar, because it sure seemed like Darlie could pretty much snap her fingers and her husband would do whatever she told him to do. And even after the murders, even after seeing all the evidence, he stood right by her side, never once implicating her in the murders. Isn't that interesting? It makes you really wonder if Darlie had actually bled to death before help arrived. Which, by the way, I don't think that was a possibility. You know, people say, oh, she almost died. Nah, I don't think so. Because at the trial, the doctors testified that her wounds were superficial and self-inflicted. And remember, she was applying pressure to her wounds. Not to either one of her sons' wounds, but she was holding that towel with pressure on her wound. Kind of like Diane Downs wrapping her arm, but not applying pressure to her children's wounds. It's all very interesting, but the similarities, I think, between the case of Darlie Routier and the case of Christopher Watts just seem too alarming to ignore.